and Shabir Safdar.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Shabir Safdar.
Here. 22 of them with documented fatalities.
And live now to a conversation with current and former Drug Enforcement Agency officials on efforts to combat trafficking of counterfeit drugs and fentanyl. We'll hear from people who have been personally affected by counterfeit drugs. This discussion hosted by the Partnership for Safe Medicine.
Concerned about the danger of counterfeit medicine to American patients. We're unique because we bring together groups that often wouldn't agree on much else if you polled them. But they all agree that counterfeits are a clear, present, and growing danger to Americans, and that we should be tightening the supply chain and not loosening it. If you'd like to join us, please see our Executive Director, Shabir Safdar, after the event. You can also find us on the web at safemedicines.org, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. This year, 22 of our member organizations felt strongly enough about the counterfeit drug threat that they asked to be our partners in this briefing. Thanks to the list of partners listed on the screen, we recognize and appreciate their assistance. In September 2017, the partnership released a report which tallied publicly reported instances of counterfeit pills made with fentanyl and its analogs. At that time, 40 states had seized these deadly pills, and 16 states had reported that residents had died after taking them. By last year's congressional briefing, that number had risen to 43 states reporting counterfeit pills, 22 of them with documented fatalities. Today, fake prescription pills have been found in 46 states and have killed people in 29 of them. To be clear, there are only 4 states in the union that have not found fake prescription pills made with illegally imported fentanyl. These pills look exactly like real Xanax, oxycodone, or Norco, or other prescription drugs. The people who take them often believe that they are taking the same dose as a genuine prescription pill, but these fakes are manufactured badly, often with so much fentanyl that a single pill is fatal. One of the most frightening things about this situation is that a large portion of these counterfeit pills, or the equipment and drugs to make them, come to the U.S. the same way other counterfeit prescription drugs come, in the mail. And because they come in the mail, often with deceptive packaging, they're very difficult to catch at the border. Today, you'll hear from victims of counterfeit drugs and families who have lost loved ones to counterfeit drugs. You'll hear from law enforcement fighting these drugs in our communities, and from agents who have battled international organized crime to stop them coming over the border. As they tell their stories, please consider the actions you can take to help protect our citizens from harm. Help educate Americans about the deadly risks of counterfeit prescription drugs. Support the law enforcement entities at the federal, state, and local level in their quest to take these products off our streets, sometimes at great risk to themselves. And protect our closed drug supply by supporting policies that tighten its security and never relax our standards through proposals like importing non-FDA approved medicines. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor over to our first panel and Shabir Safdar.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Shabir Safdar. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Safe Medicines. As Ken mentioned, we are 16 years old this year, and we're going to have 3 panels today, and the panel that we are going to have first is where we let folks who have had contact with counterfeit medicines and lost loved ones, or in the case of Rick, survived. Talk about their experience, because I don't think that you can make policy in this area if you don't understand the human toll that a counterfeit takes. And you shouldn't. If you're doing that, you're just not doing it right. When we look at America as opposed to other countries, counterfeits are typically a very low occurrence. And we as Americans are not prepared for the risk. We do not think, as people do in other countries, especially developing nations, that the pill that you get from a pharmacy may not be real. But in many countries, including where part of my family is from in Pakistan, that's part of the medical process. You get diagnosed, you get prescribed, and then you wait and see if the medicine you're taking works, because you wonder if it's counterfeit or not. We're not used to that. So when people show up, as my staff has shown in their research, with counterfeit pills with fatal amounts of fentanyl, we are particularly susceptible, much like an unvaccinated population would be. And so today I'm going to go through some of the stories of what has happened as counterfeit medicines have come to America. And hopefully that is instructive in, as we think about policies going forward, making sure that we never weaken the supply chain and only strengthen it. So my first guest is Carrie Luther. And my second guests are Caroline and Kristen DeVita, and then Rick Roberts will go last. And they each have unique stories, and I would ask you to be respectful. If you would like to speak to them either after the event or after this panel, we're happy to talk to you, but we're not going to take questions. So let me start with Carrie. Carrie and I have done some speaking together. Carrie, tell us about your son, Tosh.
Good morning. I love to talk about my son. Surprising how it still is hard. My son was a very kind-hearted man and a good friend. He was very family-oriented. He had 3 siblings, 2 nieces, and a host of friends and coworkers that just feel his absence acutely now. He was, despite his small stature, he was 5'8" and 125 pounds soaking wet. He was a great athlete, and I just loved watching him play baseball. He was a really great second baseman, and we shared a love of baseball. And we went to lots of Giants games together, San Francisco Giants games, that is. So I'm from California, if you can't tell. He had a great sense of humor. In fact, one of my favorite things that he said was, "I wish everybody thought I was as funny as I think I am." He was goofy. I have so many pictures of him with goofy expressions on his face, just being playful, with his nieces, just being playful. And he was just a really down-to-earth guy that you could count on to be a loyal friend and a loyal son, frankly. I have greeting cards where he told me how much he cared for me and how much he appreciated what he thought all the things I did for him were, just being there for him. He was 29 when he died. And I just miss him in our gatherings so much. He just brought a special presence to our family gatherings.
I know this is difficult, but can you tell us about how he encountered a counterfeit?
Yes. So he had gone to the beach with his group of buddies on a sunny afternoon in October. Actually, it's still nice and warm in California in October. And they'd gone to the beach. And at the end of the day, he went home, and he had been experiencing a severe case of hives for about 6 weeks and was seeing a doctor to figure out what was going on. What was it that he was allergic to? And so he went home, called his girlfriend, as he always did, and they talked for a period of time and said goodnight. And then about an hour later, he called her again because he couldn't sleep because of the itching from these hives. So they talked for another hour, and she said, otherwise, everything sounded normal, sounded like Tosh. And so after an hour, they hung up. But before that, they agreed that he would call her by 11 o'clock the next morning so that they could get together and hang out. And so she didn't hear from him by 11 o'clock or by 11:30. So she started calling him. and he didn't answer the phone. And so she kept trying, and he still didn't answer. And she got annoyed, like a young woman might, thinking he'd stood her up. And so she decided after a period of time that no, something's wrong. And so she went to his house, and his car was parked in the driveway. And so she went in, and his bedroom door was locked, which she said wasn't unusual. And so she went around to the back of the house and could see that he was lying on his bed on his stomach. And so she went back inside, somehow got the door unlocked, and he was lying on his stomach. She went and touched him on his shoulder, and he was cool to the touch. And so she rolled him over, and his lips were blue. So she called 911 immediately, and they instructed her how to get him on the floor and start CPR right away. And so she did that, and it was way too late. And so the paramedics took over, and they did everything possible, but it had been hours since he'd passed. So what we learned after the coroner came and he did his investigation, he didn't find anything in the room except Benadryl blister packets from his itching, and one bottle it was a Motrin bottle, and it had one pill in it. So he took all that with him and did their investigation. 9 days later, he called me and said that they had expedited the toxicology report because they feared that what had happened was true, and that they found 14 nanograms of fentanyl in his system. And he had taken what he thought was a quarter of a Xanax tablet, just a quarter, to help him sleep because of the itching. And it turned out that it was counterfeit. And he'd gotten it from a trusted acquaintance and had no idea that what he was taking wasn't Xanax. When you look at the remaining 3/4 of the pill, which I have seen, you can't tell that it's not Xanax. And he was not a drug addict. He didn't take opioids. He took a Xanax to help him sleep.
You know, one of the things that strikes me about your story is just how unprepared we are for the threat that there is a single or even a fraction of a pill out there that is deadly. Have you had experiences after that reminded you about just how we're not prepared for that danger?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the day after I learned how Tosh died at his service, immediately following afterward, a really good friend of mine's wife came up to me and said, Carrie, how you doing? You doing okay? Put her hand on my shoulder. And then she said, do you need something? And there was a Xanax in her hand. She had no idea how Tosh had passed because I just learned the day before. But that's how simple it is that so many people, and as you'll hear more about today, so many people share medications with each other. Oh, your back hurts? I have an oxycodone. You know, we just don't even think about it. But we don't know where that came from. We don't know where they got it. They may not even know where they got it, the origin of it. In fact, the young man from whom my son got his Xanax didn't know that it was counterfeit. He never would have given my son that pill had he known. Never in a million years. That's how easy it is for that to happen.
So Kristen and Caroline, your sister Maggie also had an encounter with a counterfeit. I know that you all grew up really close. Caroline, Kristen, tell me a little bit about Maggie.
Yep. I want to speak first next time. So there were 4 of us in our family, 4 kids within 5 years. So we were all very close. Maggie was 16 months younger than me and just 2 years older than Caroline. I think it sounds cliche sometimes when people pass away and then you go on about them. But I mean, truly, she was one of a kind, right? Spectacular. Even at the wake at the funeral home, the people said that they had never seen that size of a crowd come because it was everyone she had ever worked for, worked with, babysat their kids. Our pediatrician, the whole staff came, like things like that. They actually kept it open longer, hour, and it was 5 or 6 hours as it was. So, of course, the loss is devastating to me, but the magnitude at which she touched people, actually, I think really we didn't even realize until afterwards. Like people would come up to us who we had not even met to talk about her. So,
Caroline, you grew up in the same room, right? You guys shared a room.
Yes.
Maggie lived in Florida, moved down there. Tell us about how she encountered a counterfeit medicine. Either one of you is fine.
okay. So Maggie worked as a manager in an Outback Steakhouse, and she had just gotten a promotion and moved to a different location in Florida, and it was her first day at work. So she was stocking the liquor, picking up the boxes, and she threw her back out pretty badly. Someone brought her home, and she was so concerned about having to go back to work the next day, being new. She was kind of in a panic. We both spoke to her a few times that day. So she purchased an oxycodone pill from her coworker, who was also an acquaintance outside of work. And she took half of it at home, and she died almost instantly.
How did you find out? Who did they call?
It was September 1st, and it was about 11 o'clock at night. And my phone rang, and it was my brother-in-law, Maggie's husband. And I had work the next day, and he would call me sometimes if they got into like little teeny fights to be like, "Can you believe your sister did?" And so I'm like, it's just too late for this. So I didn't answer. He called back again, and we all replay that in our head. You just know, that second call back. So I'm like, so I picked up the phone, and he was so blunt, almost, Carrie. He said, "Carrie," they call me Carrie. This is Sean. Your sister died. So, I was in shock and disbelief, and being removed from the situation and not present. I didn't realize he had already called the cops, and the ambulance was there. This had been an hour and a half. I'm thinking maybe he just can't wake her up. Maybe she's sleeping, or she took Benadryl, or, he can't wake her up. And that left me with the task to, I was in New Jersey, they were in Florida. So I'm panicking, not being able to see it for myself, realize what's going on. So I hung up and called her. And, that started the chain of events to then calling my parents and realizing the sad truth that she had passed away. He found her dead in her bedroom on the floor.
A half a pill.
Mm-hmm. He came home from work. My sister's husband came home from work, went upstairs. She had hurt her back. He checked on her. She got up, gave him a kiss. Hello. Do you want to go get something to eat? Let's grab pizza, or let's just grab something quick like McDonald's. She said, I'm going to hop in the shower. He went downstairs. He switched the laundry, turned on the TV, went back upstairs to check on her, and she was dead.
And unlike in Carrie's case, where they never found the source of the manufacturing, they actually found the man who made these pills.
We are fortunate in that aspect that we were able to see justice be served for what happened to my sister, because her coworker was working almost directly with the source of the drugs, which happened to be a spine surgeon in Vero Beach, Florida. When her autopsy results came back and they detected fentanyl, the DEA instantly got involved, and they turned her friend at work who gave her the pill as an informant, and he gave the doctor up instantly and worked with the DEA. And 12 months after my sister died, he was arrested, and he was tried. We were able to go to his sentencing and give impact statements, and he had bought the pill press, the fentanyl, and other active ingredients from China, a medical doctor in Florida. And he was
In the mail, to your point.
Yeah, in the mail, the U.S. mail. And he was writing prescriptions as a legal doctor, having people fill them, come bring them back to him. And he was crushing them and sprinkling them with fentanyl and reselling them on the street. And we were, fortunate enough to actually see justice be served for our sister. But that's a rarity. I mean, a rarity that we got some sort of closure from it. Most people don't get that.
I just want to add one thing to the point that you made earlier. The pills were so well made that the DEA told our family that they were unable to discern between them until they were tested in a lab because of how well made the pill was.
I mean, this is a great success story on a tragedy, but I mean, the DEA agents were with you the entire time, right up through the sentencing when this man got at least one life sentence to be served. And
The
they actually
prosecutor
caught
as
him
well.
fleeing town, didn't they?
They did. They arrested him at the airport with about 4,000 loose pills in a large plastic bag. And I think the flight was headed to Philadelphia, which also supported, they had wiretapped someone in this investigation. And he basically referenced my sister's death as like a, all right, well, we got to get out of here then because we can't have that happen again or we'll get caught. So that also helped prove their point that he was trying to leave to redistribute in the Northeast instead.
And he would have gone on somewhere else, ordered another pill press from China and
Right.
kept on doing it.
Yep.
Ugh.
And it's so easy to get fentanyl from China.
Mhm.
Just make a phone call. That's how
Yeah.
easy it is.
So, Rick, we did not put a picture of you up here, but we have a photo
okay.
of the. You are a unique case. You are one of the earliest counterfeit victims I've met, and you are a survivor. Tell us how that happened.
So my name is Rick Roberts. I teach at the University of San Francisco, which coincidentally is where I think the story begins. As an undergrad, I moved there in the very early 80s. And we didn't know at the time, but then in 1984, HIV was discovered. And by then, many of us had been infected. So in 1988, I became very ill and was diagnosed with AIDS. There were very few treatment options at the time. So the 80s and the 90s were pretty rough times. A lot of ups and downs. And I hit a down in 2000. I was diagnosed with a related condition, and it required that I inject recombinant human growth hormone every day. I had a 12-month approval. About halfway through that, I went to my pharmacy that I'd been going to and picked up my medicine. It comes, the drug comes as a powder in a little vial and some sterile water, and you mix the two and you inject it. And I'd been doing that for months. But all of a sudden I noticed that it started stinging, and not just from the shot, but all the way till the next day it would still sting. And I couldn't find infections, and I thought that's really odd. I'm going to ask my pharmacist, but it was the holidays and I didn't have time. So I just ran in and got my next prescription filled, and the stinging went away, which was great. But I noticed the amount of sterile water wasn't always 1 cc as it had been in the past. It was sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And I thought, well, that's sloppy manufacturing. So the next time I got to the pharmacy, I asked the pharmacist and told him, I had the stinging, and he pretty matter-of-factly just said, you should go home and check. You may have gotten some of the fake stuff. We sent everything we had on the shelves back, but, some of it may have been, filled as prescriptions. So I immediately went home, took the boxes that I had just received from this pharmacy, compared to the boxes I had, and I was lazy and hadn't thrown one of the old boxes away. So I pulled that out, and it was true. If you looked at the bottles, it had really small print, the temperatures in which it should be stored. And one of the temperatures was missing the degree sign, the little round circle afterwards. And I had a set that also the ink on it was a little bit darker blue when you had another box to compare it to. Otherwise, they were vials with some white powder and clear water. So at that point, I went online and found out that one of these counterfeits had been found in 7 different states in pharmacies. And so I knew that I had gotten some of the fake stuff, told my doctor who yelled out loud when she found out. She's like, we know you didn't get the medicine you needed, but also what did you inject? If it wasn't the medicine you needed, what was it? We need to know what you've done to yourself, basically, by injecting this. And it was an ongoing investigation. So it took me 3 months, a lot of nightmares, and a really difficult time to find out what was in those 2 counterfeits. But it was true. After the investigation, I had received 2 different counterfeits of the same drug produced by two different sets of bad actors 2 months in a row. And one of the drugs was human chorionic gonadotropin. It's the hormone women make when they're pregnant. It's the basis of the pregnancy test and is used for a couple of days at a time in a cycle for fertility. I obviously was not supposed to be injecting that hormone, and certainly not on a daily basis. I thought it maybe was just the holidays, but it explains why I would suddenly like burst into tears during Hallmark commercials. And the other counterfeit was based on the foreign substances in it. Obviously, it was produced overseas, not here in the U.S. And that started my sort of connection to this issue, which I've been able to work with and study since then. These are really bad actors, and all they cared about was making money. And I got to testify against one of the companies and the people involved, and their sole supplier was in Florida. And I think about the raid they did on that company in Florida. I take 21 prescriptions a day, including insulin, which is just a small bottle with a clear liquid in it. Every time I go to the pharmacy now, I have to think, is this real?
Right.
And I go back to that sting operation in Florida because the company's name was Recus, R-E-K-C-U-S, which is an odd spelling until you recognize that's the word sucker spelled backwards. That was their licensed wholesaler name. And they handled at least one of my counterfeits for sure. So I go to the pharmacy now, and I think about the fact that in that sting, they found hundreds and hundreds of doses of insulin, not refrigerated, but in the hot Florida sun, ready for distribution. And that was just one of millions of dollars worth of medicines they found in that sting.
You know, I think about that. We talk about counterfeits, about actual substance problems in counterfeits, but even when poorly licensed or unregulated entities handle real medicine poorly, it can become ineffective, which is quite dangerous. I want to ask you, in a little bit of time we have left, HIV medications and serious therapeutic medications are unique in the counterfeiting space because if they are not real, they pose unique problems to those patients. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. When I said the treatment options had changed, we know that what's often referred to as a cocktail is required for HIV treatment, at least 3 drugs from 2 different classes. And that's because those 3 drugs then force certain mutations on the virus, and you have to maintain that pressure so the virus can't replicate. And if one of those drugs is weakened, then it allows the virus to mutate and become resistant to the other drugs. So if you get a substandard dose or not a dose at all, then there are 3 drugs from 2 classes that you now are resistant to and can no longer use in your treatment.
And I mean, how many drugs are there?
And that's just a frightening prospect because there is a finite number of drugs you can use in each of these classes.
And the virus becomes immune for the rest of your life to those drugs. You can't ever be treated with them.
I mean, I haven't been able to go back on certain drugs that for various reasons I became resistant to. And then you just cross them off.
We've seen this also with fake oncology medicine where people lose valuable and finite treatment time because they were given substandard medication and, you know, the cancer grows unchecked during that time. I want to go back to Caroline, Kristen, and Carrie. So this has been a harrowing experience for you. It's hard, I'm sure, to see a positive in all this, but is there anything that's come out of this in terms of how you look at the world differently, how you look at your medicine differently as a result of this?
Well, for me, certainly I knew right away that I needed to be proactive about this and educating people. So that's been a very good thing. I speak to high school students and junior high students, and I participate with Shabir in speaking across the nation about this issue because people need to understand, that it can happen to them. And what I've learned is, my son wasn't a drug addict, and you don't have to be a drug addict to die from a counterfeit medication. Just takes one time, and you don't get to take, there's no do-overs with that. You shouldn't die because of a mistake you made one time. And these are good people. They're not, not that drug addicts lying in the gutter are bad people, because I have compassion for them too, but people shouldn't be dying from this.
I know actually it's very funny. Caroline and I were speaking in Norfolk and she had a headache at breakfast. And I remember thinking, no, you should go to the pharmacy and buy an Advil on your own. I shouldn't give that to you. Has this experience changed you in any way?
I mean, for me personally, unfortunately, it has given me almost a little bit of a paranoia with medication and, even from, unfortunately, pharmacies and stuff like that. I've been researching the statistics and comparing how you compare and stuff. So unfortunately for me, it has given me a little bit of like a personal issue with medication. And like you said, I had a headache, and it happens all the time. I mean, at my job, if I'm like, oh, my shoulder, there's 3 hands over my desk offering something, and they're doing it with good intent.
Yeah.
There's no malice behind the offers.
Yes.
But I will, unless someone goes, here's my Advil bottle that I'm unwrapping and opening and pulling the cotton out to offer you one, there's no chance I would take anything from anyone anymore.
Yeah.
Ever.
We've seen from the incidents of the last 10 years that bricks and mortar and licensed U.S. pharmacies are very safe. It's kind of why we fight so hard now to make sure that no one weakens the drug supply. And then I think the other thing I want to leave us with is in every case, the law enforcement folks that worked on your cases were exemplary in their dedication to the kinds of cases that don't necessarily make you famous, but make you feel good about getting up in the morning. We have a lot of those law enforcement representatives here, and I want to just thank all of them for their hard work.
Thank you.
If you would like to speak to us privately, we'll be outside as the other panels go, but we would very much like to meet with you in the future. And thank you for your time. And the next panel should come up now.
So it's the fun thing for me. I have to adjust the mic way down since I have a high challenge. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see a room this full and interested in the topic. We certainly feel very passionate about. I have a very distinguished panel with me, which I'll introduce in a second. Counterfeit drugs have been and are lucrative business for illicit actors and criminal organizations. They take advantage of loopholes, regulatory and enforcement loopholes, to reap illicit profits from unsuspecting consumers and patients. And often a single picture speaks more than 1,000 words could do to explain the issue. This picture was taken and tweeted out by FDA Commissioner Gottlieb during the shutdown to ensure Americans that the agency is focused on mission-critical activities. In 1 week, at one airport, the FDA seized 1/2 ton of counterfeit drugs. 1 week, one airport. That kind of highlights the issue we're having. And in 2016, the counterfeit crisis became even more deadly with the advent of fentanyl-laced counterfeit drugs. These dangerous fakes include a wide variety of fake opioids and even counterfeit Xanaxes. And as you had seen before, these drugs have now spread to 46 states and resulted in death in 29. This concerning increase was also highlighted by the DEA in their 2018 National Drug Threat Assessment Report. The DEA in their report highlights, in particular, that increasingly fentanyl is being sold in the form of counterfeit prescription pills, and that criminal actors adjust their supplies in an attempt to circumvent new regulations. In addition, the availability and use of fentanyl containing counterfeit pills demonstrate a relationship with the sudden outbreak of overdose death. And when we look towards the overdose numbers, the most recent ones we have from 2018, we certainly see this dangerous threat and correlation starting to play out. With this, I want to introduce my panel, who will help us examine the issues that counterfeits provide for law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level. We have a great panel today to help us explore these issues and challenges that counterfeit drugs provide and the impact importation could have on their challenges. I would like for you to welcome Deputy Assistant Administrator Keith Brown from the DEA. Keith Brown is the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Diversion Control Division at Drug Enforcement Administration headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. In his role, Mr. Brown is heavily engaged in various programs at DEA that have a direct impact on the opioid drug crisis in the United States, particularly in the development of policies and regulations, the identification and scheduling of dangerous new controlled substances, and in outreach and training. Mr. Brown has been a special agent with the DEA since 1995. He has served in Texas, Tennessee, New Mexico, Louisiana, the DEA Special Operations Division, and DEA headquarters. Sheriff Kane joins us from Daviess County, Kentucky, where he has served the Daviess County Sheriff Department since 1974 in various capacities, including as patrol deputy, chief deputy, and chief of investigations. His work experience includes extensive narcotics investigations, both as an undercover capacity as well as case investigator. Sheriff Kane serves in various leadership roles for the National Sheriff's Association. He is a member of the board of directors and the chairman of the Drug Enforcement Committee. Most recently, he was elected to the executive committee of the National Sheriff's Association. Finally, please help me welcome Executive Director Daniel Salter. Daniel Salter joins us today from Atlanta, Georgia. He served as a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration for 31 years. For 6 of those years, he was a special agent in charge of the Atlanta and Dallas DEA offices. Following his service with the DEA, he was selected to serve as the executive director for the Atlanta, Carolinas High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program, also known as HIDA. HIDA is administered through a grant program within the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP, of the Executive Office of the President. Executive Director Salter is responsible for HIDA's mission to reduce drug trafficking and production for the states of Georgia, North, and South Carolina. Please welcome the panel. All right, gentlemen, shall we?
Sure. Absolutely. I'm being interrogated.
All right, here we go. Executive Director Salter, start us off and kind of what I talked about are some statistics, but you really see it live, so to speak, in the field every day. Talk to us about what you see about counterfeit opioids, the trends nationally. Kind of what drugs do you see? What are the trends? What do you encounter? And with that, what are the biggest issues that law enforcement across all levels is encountering?
I think it's real easy to look at what the panel before us and the real victims, the families that suffer through this. Oftentimes law enforcement doesn't get associated with victims. But we have family and loved ones that have dealt with addiction. We huddle often with victims. As you heard some of the panels before, it was DEA that brought the justice and brought them a little peace of mind. And I think the community needs to know that law enforcement, we are community, we are victims as well. And so we take it personal. When we look at the importation of counterfeits and what's going on, you're seeing almost a 46% increase between 16 and 17 of counter opioid deaths in the United States. As you look at the numbers, you hear numbers of in excess of 70,000 people dying of drug overdoses. What people don't stop and realize is how many lives were saved because of law enforcement first responders that administered naloxone. That number could well be 2 or 3 times higher of deaths. So the biggest challenge we face is the fact that these cartels, specifically Mexican cartels, are they make a living on the backs of addiction, or they make a living on the backs of a high that they can induce through fentanyl being counterfeited into these pills that look, as you heard before, just like the real thing.
Well, I appreciate it. Deputy Assistant Administrator Brown, wanted to kick it to you. As we showed in DEA's recent 2018 Drug Threat Assessment Report, you highlighted the issue of these drugs. Can you talk to us about kind of where do these drugs come from? How do they get into this country? What are the ways how they get in? Is it sea? Is it cargo? Is it mail? And kind of what with that are the enforcement challenges you are seeing as an agency?
Thanks for having us here today. The counterfeit threat is one of the fastest growing opioid threats. And it's, Dan alluded to it, the Mexican cartels, and we've got some great speakers who are going to talk about them here in a little while. It's unfettered capitalism. Okay. It is make a dollar without any restriction, oversight, care, thought for outcome, anything. So what you realize in the United States is that even though we have a large heroin abuse population, the population of prescription drug users dwarfs that population. Right? The last survey, drug use survey done, there's 475,000 people who admitted to using heroin. There's 3.5 million who admit to using a prescription drug not for a medical purpose, not as it was prescribed to them by a doctor. So the cartels recognize that population is worth a lot more money to them than the heroin population. They already sort of cornered the heroin market. But as we fight to reduce the number of prescriptions and reduce the availability of diverted opioids and just the flow of opioids that happened in the mid 2000, 2008, 9, 10, the demand for it is still there. Right. And so they step in with these counterfeits. They are motivated by greed to figure out a way to get the tabling machines, to get the fentanyl, to get the binders, to get the dyes that mimic these pills, produce them, then smuggle them in the United States, right, where there's a huge market for it. Right. So the cartels are just capitalizing on the American demand for opioids, and that's and fentanyl, unfortunately, is the game changer in the opioid space. It is opioids are dangerous, substances. Fentanyl is off the charts dangerous, and I think that when you combine that greed and that sort of willingness to do whatever to make a dollar with this dangerous a substance, the outcome is horrific.
Well, I appreciate your perspective. Thank you. That's certainly always sobering news. Sheriff Kane, as the chair of the NSA Drug Enforcement Committee, you have quite a unique perspective because on your committee, you collaborate with all levels of law enforcement, federal, state, local. Can you give me kind of your perspective as the enforcement chair, what the issues are from stopping these drugs first coming into the country, and then plus, once they're in the country, what are the issues that they create for local law enforcement?
Sure. I do represent about 3,200 sheriffs across the nation that are members of the National Sheriff's Association. And I will tell you quite frankly and very candidly, to get 3,200 sheriffs to agree to anything is a magnanimous task. But one thing that we are unified on is this issue that we're here discussing today. We've been monitoring the issue for about 2 or 3 years now, particularly as it relates to the opioid epidemic. These powerful fentanyls and fentanyl analog-laced counterfeit pills are being produced, as you've already heard testimony of these illegal trafficking organizations. They're primarily originating in China and then moving into the U.S. via borders north and south. We've consistently at our committee, the Drug Enforcement Committee at the National Sheriff's Association, heard from our federal partners concerning this issue. They tell us that they are difficult to intercept since they hide amongst a legitimate stream of commerce, and their mask is either the real thing, the legitimate drugs, or a lesser harmless drug. They see ever increasing amounts of fentanyl-laced counterfeit opioids being seized at the border, but those are the success stories. It's what impacting local law enforcement are those that are not being seized. And I've heard figures that for every seizure made, there's 8 that doesn't. I don't know the legitimacy of that. What I do know is what we're seeing in our communities and local law enforcement. Law enforcement officers from sheriff's offices and police departments included encounter these fake fentanyl-laced opioids everywhere. We see them on traffic stops. We see them certainly on our drug bust. We see them at domestic violence calls, and we tragically see them in cases such as you've already heard testimony about here this morning. They pose a risk to public health, most certainly, and they undermine our efforts in the opioid crisis. They make a very difficult, a very dangerous job that much more burdensome. They also stretch the limits of law enforcement. Local law enforcement resources are extremely limited, and the criminal activity that always follows this stretches those resources even further. We're concerned about these on a local level, as we well should be. In my home state, you've already heard Dan mention over 70,000 Americans die as a result of this poison. In my home state in 2017, that number was 1,565 of my fellow Kentuckians, many of them young people, that died as a result of opioid-related overdoses. 52% of those, over half, were these counterfeit opioid substances that we're talking about here today.
Well, thank you. Again, very sobering news, and I appreciate that. That's a tall task for all law enforcement. Deputy Administrator Brown, I wanted to ask you just to briefly also highlight for us, and it was already brought up, but in your report, you also talked about the impact that these drugs have on overdoses. And the overdoses not only within the addiction community, but also spreading to other communities. Can you briefly touch on what you have seen with that?
Well, I think your chart tells it all. And that chart, we have that chart, may have came from us. I'm not sure, but the introduction of fentanyl and the combination of fentanyl with the counterfeit opioids and counterfeit Xanax or alprazolam is changing the scene. The good news is in the United States, we are reducing the number of prescriptions for opioids. Hydrocodone, for example, is 42% down, the number of prescriptions of hydrocodone from its height. In 2011, there was 17.2 billion with a B dosage units of opioids distributed in the United States. And I encourage you to think about that number and think about the number of people in the United States. And that's roughly 5 pills for every man, woman, child in the United States of America. But we have reduced that total number down to 12.6 billion. There is further work to do in that reduction. But as always in this space, the law of unintended consequences, we're reducing the supply. The demand still exists. And I think some great examples. So you have communities that have substance abuse addiction problems. That's a huge demand. But then some of our earlier panelists and their tragic stories, we refer to them as opioid naive users. They're a very high risk population. It's they're these one-time fatal uses. And again, that's the danger of these counterfeit substances, because they look like stuff you get at the pharmacy. It's easy to sell people that, I got this from my doctor. And sometimes it's with the most innocent of intent that somebody picked up something and just trying to help a friend. But also, from the cartels and the trafficking organizations' perspective, they're trying to develop customers and expand the business and to make money. And so they've had a tremendous impact on the opioid crisis, because and from our perspective, Dan and them alluded, and the sheriff alluded to, I tell people all the time, people come into our business, law enforcement, and they say, you can't take this personal. If you don't take this personal, go find something else to do. Okay. These are people dying.
Yeah.
We all know people who have died. And so I think the frustrating thing for me and so many others is we succeed in reducing prescriptions and turning the corner and educating. Here come the counterfeits. Here come the fentanyls. Yeah. And it's just a never ending struggle. We're not going to stop, but we hope that we can educate people to stop just taking something that you don't know exactly where it came from.
Well, I appreciate it. Sheriff Kane, when you and I have been talking on this topic, obviously for a while, one of the stories that sometimes doesn't get covered is what these fentanyl-laced counterfeits actually do to law enforcement themselves, the impact they had on law enforcement operations. Can you briefly touch on kind of what you see as far as what fentanyl-laced and fentanyl itself has done to your law enforcement operations?
Sure. Although it's already been spoken to today, it bears repetition. Fentanyl and fentanyl-laced drugs provide a very, very unique challenge, particularly to local law enforcement. You're going to hear about these cartels. I've read about the cartels. I've tried to verse myself as well as I can, but I don't know a lot about them. When I was a young narcotics officer in the late 70s and the early 80s, I didn't know anything about Pablo Escobar, Steve, and Javier. I read about it, saw it on TV. I've seen the movie, and those guys are a lot better looking than you are. But what I did see is I saw his cocaine and what it did to my community on an all too regular basis. The same is true with regards to the evil that we're dealing with today, the fentanyl. I would argue it's one of the most dangerous, it's one of the most deadly, it's one of the most addictive medicines this nation has ever seen. And the fact that people continue to voluntarily abuse it speaks to its addictive qualities. But not only are those people being victimized, you've already heard from the people that don't even know that they're taking it, that it's killing. But there's also other people that are being victimized for it also. It's our officers. It's the individuals that are responsible for serving each and every one of you. Exposure to minimum amounts of fentanyl, they tell me less than a milligram. In layman's terms, that's just 1 or 2, 3 grains of table salt of this stuff will kill you. And our officers are coming in contact with it on an all too frequent basis, as I indicated. We have to take additional precautions. For example, recently my office implemented, as has many law enforcement agencies across the country, we no longer field test controlled substances that we seize to establish probable cause and make cases. We don't do it anymore because we won't allow our officers to handle this. So what's the long-term effect of that? Those substances then have to be sent to already overburdened state laboratories, which prolongs the results, and oftentimes people that should be prosecuted are not prosecuted. Naloxone, that has already been mentioned, a godsend. Naloxone in officer squad cars is becoming common practice, not only to reverse the overdoses for its victims, but for those officers that encounter it. I'm very proud to tell you that the National Sheriff's Association took a lead in this initiative with law enforcement and first responders. And a few years ago, we supported a naloxone grant program, which we administered. Through that program, we trained over 1,000 officers in its use, and we distributed thousands of dosage units of the naloxone to 39 law enforcement agencies in 21 states. And we don't know the numbers of the people that are walking around today that are alive because of that initiative.
That's wonderful. Thank you for your hard work. Executive Director Salter, talk to me a little bit about the difficulties of enforcement. We hear a lot that a lot of these counterfeit drugs are being brought in by foreign actors, brought in by folks that claim to be Canadian or not, or are, or other countries. What enforcement challenges does it bring to bring those criminals to justice?
Well, I think one of the things was a photograph you showed of the tonnage of drugs that were seized at the airport in New York. The dark web has made a significant impact on drug law enforcement too, because of the openness and the familiarity with the dark web. You can acquire just about anything, and many of the folks are ordering their fentanyl through the dark web. and also just general mail, postal. It's a challenge, but the number of packages that come in from overseas, and it's certainly very difficult, if not impossible, to examine each package that comes in. And we're not talking about what you asked, what the impact on drug law enforcement. It's a small amount of fentanyl. Because I noticed a huge seizure yesterday by our Customs and Border Protection on the southwest border. I can't remember, 250 kilograms of fentanyl.
Several kilos.
You're talking 1 kilogram can produce millions of dosage units of pills, and that's something we that's why you ask. We were talking the other day. We're asking why are they mixing now fentanyl with methamphetamine, fentanyl and cocaine, and we've even seen fentanyl or marijuana laced with fentanyl. Why? Because of its addictive ingredients. That's why. If these cartels can make what I'd say a zombie society of Americans that are addicted to pain medicine, they'll do it. And so the problem is we have got to get out in front of what these counterfeits are doing to regular citizens that think this society will take a pill for anything. We've seen it when you go back many years ago, you want to lose 50 pounds, take this pill. And now we're seeing counterfeit medicine that is it looks just like what we take at home is prescribed through our doctors and our pharmacists have provided, and it's been regulated and tested. These are not chemists manufacturing these pills. These are idiots in a garage that are stamping this stuff together, whether it's in Mexico or in this country, and putting it out and killing people. So the problem is if we don't get out in front with it, it's almost impossible. Every package that comes across, if it's a kilo of fentanyl, you're talking about 1 million dosage units that could hit our streets.
And because these folks are based, as you say, in Mexico, et cetera, does that itself provide an additional challenge?
Absolutely. And that's one thing we've worked very well. And I talk about my predecessor agency when I was with DEA and now with HIDA. We do work with our foreign counterparts regularly. We work with the China authorities. We work with the Canadian authorities and the Mexican authorities. But it's really tough for the number of cartels that are associated in transporting and distributing the stuff to get out in front of it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So Sheriff Kane, talk to me about, we kind of highlighted what it is, and what we want to also talk about is, we'll talk about things that hopefully make it better, but also talking about what things we potentially might do that potentially might worsen this. The NSA has come out strongly and consistently on the proposed issue of importation. Can you talk to me about NSA's opposition on importation and what were your main concerns? What led you to take that position?
Sure. Based on the information that we had received that I've already spoke to in the committee in 2017, the Drug Enforcement Committee of the National Sheriff's Association passed a resolution. Part of that resolution reads, and I quote, opposes drug importations legislation which jeopardizes law enforcement's ability to protect the public health and endangers the safety of law enforcement and other first responders. Our concerns were and continue to be shared by knowledgeable others on a national perspective. Former FBI Director Louis Freeh had 3 key findings in 2017 on his report. First, drug importation would increase the threat of illegitimate products, such as counterfeits entering the U.S. That in turn fuels criminal organizations' activities and profits. 2, drug importation proposals would worsen the opioid crisis, a crisis that has already grown substantially worse due to the powerful opioid fentanyl and fentanyl analog-laced counterfeit pills being produced by illegal trafficking organizations. And 3, an already overburdened law enforcement and regulatory capacity would be unable to ensure a safe prescription drug supply under importation. And similarly, in that same year, in March of 2017, an open letter to Congress from 4 of the most recent commissioners of the FDA. These are individuals that probably know more about this subject than all of us combined. They're the professionals. These were their findings. Serious risk to patients and consumers. We're talking about drug importation. Drugs purchased from foreign countries may be substandard, unsafe, adulterated, and fake. The FDA lacks the resources needed to oversee a major importation program. The global drug supply will limit improvement in access. And 5, any improved access and cost savings resulting from importation are likely to be minimal. Therefore, our organization, the National Sheriff's Association, has repeatedly voiced our concerns and asked Congress and this administration to carefully weigh the potential harmful impact of drug importation on public safety and public health. Look, folks, we're not without heart. We understand people need lower drug prices, and there should be an ongoing dialogue to try to resolve that issue. But we don't want to create a huge problem by trying to solve another one. Finally, our own Chief Executive Officer has reiterated recently that the NSA opposes any legislation that further exposes the United States to counterfeit and adulterated medication from illegitimate foreign pharmacy websites and criminal organizations. Given the current crisis already faced by our law enforcement with illegal drugs and the abuse of prescription drugs, now is not the time for the enactment of drug importation legislation that would only exacerbate that crisis in public health and safety.
I appreciate that. To kind of wrap up, I want to quickly give that same question to Executive Salter and Deputy Assistant Administrator Brown. So, Executive Director Salter, what impact do you think importation would have on local law enforcement resources at the state, local, federal level, since you see all of them in your task forces?
Well, I think it's a huge impact on local, state, and federal law enforcement because it's intensive. It's intensive. Again, you look at what could be a small FedEx or like envelope with 2,000 or 3,000 dosage units and impact an entire community. So that is at a local level. Oftentimes, we won't know of a problem until we start seeing. This is really sad. Till we start seeing a number of overdoses going on in the community. We had one in Middle Georgia a couple of years ago. 7 to 10 people started overdosing. With our partnership with public health, we were notified right away, and we were able to disperse state and local folks out to do an investigation. And it was fake Percocet, but it looked just like it, and the community was taking it. We used the social media to get the word out because it's outside law enforcement, but we needed to notify the community. Listen, there's fake Percocet in Middle Georgia. Don't take it. And that was successful, but it's a different concept how we think in law enforcement, but we have to partner with public health. And that's what we've done at ONDCP and HIDE, partner with public health to basically get an alert system started when we do have an outbreak in certain communities.
I appreciate it. And Deputy Assistant Administrator Brown, kind of closing words for you. When you look towards the impact that, like an importation would have that increases the flow of foreign drugs into the United States, what impact do you think this would have, especially looking towards your 2018 threat assessment? Do you think it would make the counterfeit opiate issue worse, and kind of how do you look at it?
Well, so this is with opioids, it's a multi-layered problem. The law right now does not allow for it's unlawful to import an opioid into the United States for legitimate importation unless we in the FDA deem there to be a shortage. There is not a shortage of opioids manufactured in the United States currently. Okay. So that's the opioid issue. And so the counterfeits, though, as we reduce that supply, they try to fill that space. Mm-hmm. Other controlled substances, and there's a difference between all drugs and controlled substances, just so everybody understands. Insulin is a drug. It's not a controlled substance, so we don't oversee it. Other controlled substances, the importation, in order for us to allow an importation, it has to be an FDA-approved product, and there has to be, based on our understanding of the demand in the United States, legitimate demand, we will allow that importation. DEA has no role other than supporting the FDA in the drugs that are not controlled substances. So for now, the opioid importation is so limited that it doesn't directly affect the counterfeit space. But as we discussed earlier, when you start having manufacturing done outside the United States, DEA has a regulatory responsibility. The FDA has a regulatory responsibility. Our abilities in that space are so diminished when the manufacturers are not responsible to United States law as they do it. So it is a worry. There is good news on the opioid front, is that the amount of opioids imported in the United States is very limited, especially the most dangerous ones. But it is a worry.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you to the panel. I really appreciate your insights. I appreciate the time. We'll also be available outside if there's additional follow-up questions. We're now going to turn to the topic that was discussed, that there's a lot of foreign actors out there that mean ill. There's some experts here who have very unique experience in that. And with that, please thank the panel for the participation, and we'll move on.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to begin by asking everybody to please keep the police officers who were ambushed in Houston in your thoughts and prayers until they're released from the hospital. It's our pleasure and honor to address this briefing today to talk about the international aspect. Our previous colleagues talked about the law enforcement issue, but let's talk more about the international aspect. To give you a couple of introductory thoughts about how that manifests itself from a prescription drug perspective, the National Association Boards of Pharmacy does a survey every year and tells us that 96% of all internet pharmacies targeting U.S. patients do not comply with U.S. laws. So if you think about all the emails you get every day and your family and your parents, 96% of those pharmacies are illicit. The World Customs Organization will tell us that counterfeit prescription medicines is a $200 billion underground economy with a B. Now, to put that in perspective, that's more than heroin and cocaine combined at $160 billion annually. I know that we historically remember that counterfeit medicines began with lifestyle medicines, erectile dysfunction, and propecia. But today we have traditional organized crime groups like the Mafia, the Camorra in Naples, Italy. We've got illicit drug trafficking organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel. We've got the MS-13, the most violent street gang this country has ever seen, manufacturing counterfeit medicines destined exclusively to the United States. I recently spoke with an MS-13 associate who told me that 40% of their operating revenue comes from counterfeit medicines sold in the United States. So when you think about the magnitude and complexity of that description, it's a global issue. And so what we've done today is we're going to take our panel and expand on what the last group talked about. We've got an esteemed panel of colleagues that I will ask to introduce themselves and give us a brief background on their experience, and then we'll do a Q&A. If I may just begin, my name is Aaron Graham. I currently serve as Executive Director for Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals. I began my career with DEA and actually worked as an undercover agent, a SWAT agent, and volunteered for assignment to Guadalajara, Mexico, after our agent Kiki Camarena was kidnapped and murdered. Some of you may have seen that in the most recent season of Narcos. So it was during that time that I met Steve Murphy and Javier Peña, who were in Colombia at the time and taking down the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel, Pablo Escobar. And we were seizing tons and tons of cocaine in Mexico based on information provided by Steve and Javier. It was that background that gave me the ability to work now on these cartels. We worked on Chapo when he was just a pistolero. He was a nobody, and now he's the big guy. So today, if I could ask Don Bell, I think what's interesting today is we have a police officer from Canada. We have a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have the most widely known and our proudest DEA brothers from DEA Narcos with us today to provide some perspective. So if I could ask Don just to briefly introduce himself, and we'll come back to him later with, I think, answers to questions that you've not heard the truth about heretofore. Don?
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Don Bell. I'm from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I served 32 and a half years with the Ontario Provincial Police, which would be equivalent to a state police agency. I retired as a chief superintendent. I spent as the director of the Intelligence Service of Ontario, responsible for intelligence in the province. As an OPP officer, I oversaw the Organized Crime Investigation Support Bureau, as well as our professional standards. After my retirement, I served as the director of enforcement intelligence for the Canada Border Service Agency for the Greater Toronto Area. And now I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Firearms Safety in the province.
Thanks, Don, for being here. Next up is Sam Lewis. Sam won't tell you this, so I will. Without a doubt, the most progressive assistant U.S. attorney in the United States, prosecuting healthcare crimes and counterfeit medicines in particular. Sam, could you please give us some more background?
Aaron, I can't take your case anymore. I'm not with the government, so you don't need to do that.
Okay.
But hi, good morning. My name is Sam Lewis. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Clark Hill Strasburger. But prior to going into private practice, I was a federal prosecutor for 21 years, assigned to the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Texas. And throughout my time from 1992 to 2013, in 2005, became involved in the prosecution of counterfeit pharmaceuticals. And as the previous panel said, I also was involved with prosecuting drug trafficking, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and in 2005 was approached about counterfeit medicines, which I had no idea. We'll talk about that later.
Thank you, Sam. Next, I'll ask Javier Pena, who many of you have seen on Netflix Narcos, as the leader of the group that took down Pablo Escobar, the Medellin and the Cali cartels, to please introduce himself.
Thank you, Aaron. My name's Javier Pena. Did 30 years with DEA, retired, and my experience, I started off in Austin, Texas, and great place to work. And then I went to Colombia for about 6 years, got involved with the Pablo Escobar investigation. After that, headquarters, then San Antonio, then got promoted, went to San Francisco. After San Francisco, the Caribbean, then went back to Colombia, then I finally retired as the agent in charge in Houston, Texas, which we oversaw the southwest border.
Thanks, Javier. As you see, like so many of us, I actually began as a San Diego police officer. Steve was a police officer. Javi was a police officer. Don was a police officer. And I think we all initially saw the havoc that substance abuse will wreak on a community. And we all said, maybe we should go to the place that could stem this issue more aggressively on an international level. So with that, I'd ask my friend and colleague, Steve Murphy, to please introduce himself.
Hey, good morning. I'm Steve Murphy. I was a police officer for almost 38 years, the last 26 being with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Was fortunate enough to be posted in several places around the United States and the world, be in Miami, Bogota, Greensboro, North Carolina, believe it or not, Atlanta twice, and Washington, D.C. twice. Have the dubious reputation, I guess, of being partners with this guy. And I just rode his coattail for 3 years, and I got all the credit. So it worked out pretty good for me.
So we'll hear more about the Pablo Escobar Medellin cartel. For the sake of time, you won't hear the whole story, but you know where to find Netflix. And I would only add, as their friend, they are doing a show tomorrow night at the Lincoln Theater where you'll hear the 2-hour version of how they got there. So I think it'll be an exciting event. You know, we talk a lot about importation, not importation like the previous panel talked about with really drug traffickers importing medicines clandestinely like fentanyl. But we're talking about wholesale importation where we think we can make this a legitimate attempt to make medicines more affordable. And of course, the issue that's always raised is, well, we'll do it in partnership with Canada. In other words, what that means is we'll let Canada do the hard work and ensure that the medicines we get are safe. And so I guess the question I would start with Don, who's our expert, we're so fortunate to have him here because this doesn't happen very often. You know, often we talk about a Canadian pharmacy, Don, and a patient in Austin, Texas fills a prescription on an online pharmacy from Canada. I think the question that people don't understand is, can a pharmacy in Canada fill that prescription?
No, so a legitimate bricks and mortar pharmacy or any pharmacist cannot fill a prescription written by an American doctor. It has to be written by a Canadian doctor.
And so you can see the issue that poses. If you live in northern Michigan, fine, walk across the border. But if you live in Mississippi or San Diego, where I grew up, or Laredo, where Javi grew up, or Tennessee, you're probably not going to have that access to a Canadian doctor. One of the other fallacies that I really would like to kind of refute and at least challenge is we're going to make Canada responsible for ensuring that all medicines received from everywhere else in the world are safe before they arrive in America. So the question I'm dying to know, Don, and we've talked about it, but I'm just trying to understand when medicines are sourced in clandestine labs and other unauthorized manufacturing operations in Southeast Asia and elsewhere and transshipped through Canada to U.S. patients, who is it exactly in Canada that vets those medicines, tests those medicines, and puts the seal of approval on the safety and efficacy of those medicines that are coming to U.S. patients?
So Health Canada has oversight of medications that come into the country, that being domestic sales, drugs that are going domestically that are going to be used by Canadians. Drugs that are being transshipped through Canada as other parcels will not bear the same inspection and do not have to have the same quality assurance. So ultimately, the responsibility falls on the country of destination. So you're relying on the country of origin to ensure that the quality assurance is in place, and then you'd be relying on your customs people to pick off anything that's untoward.
So just to kind of add to what Don shared with us, there is no entity in Canada with that responsibility or those resources. Secondarily, we're currently conducting undercover investigations targeting cancer medicines that, while they appear to be manufactured in one country in Southeast Asia, the entity doesn't even exist in that country. They're operating totally clandestinely in another Southeast Asian nation, manufacturing medicines without any inspection authority, shipping them clandestinely through the mails, using PayPal accounts in a third Southeast Asian nation. And yet we're supposed to believe that those medicines will be safe and efficacious. I think something that Keith shared with us that I want to repeat, and that is, and you'll hear it from all of us here, the passion that we bring to our law enforcement career is immeasurable. You don't run around the deserts of Mexico with a machine gun chasing Colombians if you're not passionate. You don't do what you saw these two crazy guys doing on Narcos in Colombia if you're not passionate. But when it comes to counterfeit medicines, it becomes personal. I'm sure everybody in this room has been touched by cancer. My mom was a breast cancer survivor. She got good treatment. We expect women who are exposed to breast cancer and diagnosed early to survive, and she did. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, she did not survive, but she got good treatment until she passed. As you know, the problem is if you get a subtherapeutic dose of cancer medicine over a period of time, you die of cancer. First of all, there is no autopsy because you died of a fatal disease, cancer. And even if somebody said, gosh, I don't know, there's something wrong here, do the autopsy. You know what it'll show? Died of cancer. There was not an adverse event. There was not a fentanyl-related event. They died of cancer. So how do we let those products in the country undetected, unexamined? And yet that's what, as Don has eloquently stated, that's what would happen without some infusion of billions and billions of dollars and the creation of entire new enforcement schemes. Sam, maybe you could tell us about some of the real challenges of prosecuting these international drug trafficking organizations who are smuggling counterfeit medicines into the United States.
So let me give you a little bit of backdrop before I go there. So I was involved in prosecuting, as I said, controlled substances, the marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and then I was transferred over to the healthcare group. And I was approached by a Department of Homeland Security agent about handling a case involving a person who was in Shelton, Washington, who was selling lifestyle drugs. And so my first question to him is, why should I be concerned about that in Southern District of Texas? Because the guy was actually using the internet. So they had purchased these products, these lifestyle drugs, had them tested by the FDA, also from the manufacturers, and determined they were counterfeit. And at that time, the Department of Justice was trying to get China to do something with the scourge of counterfeit drugs that were identified as coming from China. And my case was identified as one that they would be interested in doing something. So I actually traveled over to China and was involved in a joint investigation with Chinese authorities. 11 Chinese nationals were arrested. And what just opened my eyes up was the labs. It was filthy. It was dirty. These were where the counterfeit drugs were actually being made. They were made with road paint. They were made with gypsum, with drywall in them, and they were coming into the United States. And so that drove my passion. And so I'll tell you about another case involving a person by the name of Kevin Shue, which was probably one of the most prolific cases. Mr. Shue owned a generic manufacturing company, and he supplied generic pharmaceutical drugs to the Chinese government. On his other job was to send drugs to the UK and the US. And as we talked about earlier, the very first drugs were lifestyle drugs. Well, these weren't lifestyle drugs. These were Casadix, Plavix, Zyprexa, Lipitor, drugs that you use for everyday issues. And so while the agent is meeting with him, he is talking about how he has been successfully sending drugs to the UK, secreted in barrels that had active ingredient on it that was never, ever inspected. And the drugs were then coming into the US. So we had a task force in the Southern District of Texas comprised of Department of Homeland Security, FDA, and Postal. We worked very hard to first purchase undercover packages from him. Agents actually met with him in Bangkok, Thailand, where he actually outlined and provided his laundry list of drugs, and the amount of money was astounding. So we worked with counterparts in the UK, in Thailand, and we actually worked with components within the Department of Justice to actually get approval to lure somebody. So we actually had to work on the authority to bring that person, a Chinese national, into the United States for purposes of arresting him. And one of the key issues, his wife loved jewelry. So she was ecstatic about coming to Houston and shop at the Galleria. And I think that was the impetus for him to come to the U.S. While the agents were meeting with him, what he said was so interesting. While he was meeting with them and talking about the different drugs, he said, for specifically cancer drugs, they won't never know because these people are going to die anyway. And that was recorded and that was played in court at his trial. But that was successful in luring somebody here, but actually trying to reach out and to prosecute foreign nationals. It can be done. I was actually successful in extraditing someone from Bangkok, Thailand, who was involved in trafficking counterfeit drugs, but it was a rare exception. There are a number of hoops. Number one, first of all, you got to identify who they are. If they are not coming into the U.S., you have to look at what treaty we have with that country. And then you also have to look at what law is comparable with the U.S. law, what the punishment is for that law. And then you actually have to coordinate with that country's jurisdiction on what would be the limits on the charges. So if our statute said if somebody was trafficking in counterfeit pharmaceuticals and the penalty range was 0 to 10 years, and it's determined, of course, on a number of factors, the value of the drugs, the amount, and that country's statute says, well, it's a misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year, well, then we would be limited on what that country's specific laws are. And then trying to be able to extradite somebody. I actually was involved in another investigation of a Chinese national who was involved in counterfeiting steel, apparel, and pharmaceuticals. We worked very hard I was on the coattails of the agents who worked very hard, so I was a beneficiary of all their hard work. But we were successful in getting the Thailand government to allow agents to lure her to Thailand for purposes of arresting her. A lot of hoops to go through, a lot of authority to approvals. That happened. She arrived at the airport. She was arrested. We're all high-fiving. This is a 2-year endeavor. We're excited. And we think, man, we've made an impact because this person was connected with the Chinese government. While we're working on the extradition package, 2 weeks later, the Chinese government put a lot of pressure on the judiciary and law enforcement of that country. Unbeknownst to us, there was a hearing held and called by the magistrate judge. She was unceremoniously given a bond and went back to China. So not always easy.
Yeah, so I think it's a great explanation of the difficulties of prosecuting international traffickers. With that, I want to segue to Javier and Stephen. If you guys could just give us a brief overview of, tell us about how Pablo began his criminal career. What was he doing? How did he become the first ever narco terrorist in the world? And then from there, if you want to start, Javier.
Pablo Escobar began his career by stealing hubcaps, headstones at the graves, and him and his cousin, they were inseparable, they're always together. Anyway, so they started 1 kilo, 2 kilos at a time. And before we knew it, Pablo Escobar was responsible for 80% of the cocaine that was reaching the world. And we talk about it. I mean, this is a lesson in history, how one person can actually challenge his country and actually win. But it just goes to show the empire created was based on violence. And, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, but these traffickers that are living outside the United States, you think they care? They do not care. They don't, as long as they can get their drugs, their counterfeit medication, which what we're seeing, their distribution routes are already established. So they're going to try to, like everybody has said, the theme this morning is, as long as they're out there to make money, they do not care about people dying here in the United States. So it was an empire built on violence. Like you said, he was the richest narco trafficker in the world we had ever seen. So we learned a lot of lessons. And we're seeing this with Mexico now. As we all know, their famous trial right now in Chapa. I think they're finishing them in New York right now. But again, as long as they can make money, they do not care. They're going to send whatever they can, be cocaine, meth, heroin. And now we're seeing the counterfeit medication that they're getting into.
So to add on to that, let me just ask Steve to talk about the sophistication. So you were in Miami, you were in Tennessee, and now all of a sudden you see the world's largest cocaine trafficking organization. And I think without my wife giving me a bad time about admiring drug traffickers, it was not that, right? But you have to respect your adversary. Tell us about the level of sophistication from the smuggling to the money laundering to the corruption and payoffs.
Well, you're talking about an individual here that actually offered to pay off the national debt of Colombia, the millions and billions of dollars. That's how much money we're talking about here. We're talking about an individual who actually ran for Congress, because in Colombia, if you're an elected official, you cannot be arrested. So his whole platform was anti-extradition. He did not want extradition laws where they could be sent to the United States to serve a true sentence. So these are not single mission organizations. Like, he started out as a petty thief. That's what he started out as. And then he graduated into marijuana. Then he graduated into cocaine. Well, you know what? When heroin became a product that they could produce in Colombia, they graduated over into that. So we call these polycriminal organizations. They're not bound to just one crime that they'll commit. They'll commit a crime anywhere they can to make money. Now, one of his Achilles heels was, if you're generating all this cash, what do you do with it? Well, it just so happened that Pablo and his organization loved bulk cash. They liked the US dollars coming back into them in Colombia, which presented us with opportunities to make seizures, right? But then when you get that bulk cash down there, what do you do with it? Because now you're in a country that trades in Colombian pesos, not US dollars. So you can't just walk into a Colombian bank and say, I'd like to deposit these $3 billion or whatever it might be. And you're talking about this guy's net worth. Forbes magazine, this is not the US government making up these statistics. This is Forbes magazine, an internationally recognized financial magazine, estimated Pablo's wealth at between $8 and $30 billion with the big old B, okay? And it wasn't just 1 year that he was recognized as one of the richest people in the world. It was several years running. Now, what's interesting about that, and I'm not even sure you know this, Aaron, is that once this was announced a couple or 3 years into it, Pablo's son actually called Forbes magazine and said, no, you got it completely wrong. It's a lot more than $30 billion. The truth is, we don't know how much money the guy really was worth. But that's what it all boils down to. And that's how this ties into what we've been talking about this morning, counterfeit medications. It's all about making the dollar. Just like Keith said, it's all about making a buck at the expense of innocent people. And not to get on a soapbox here, but just, when we're talking about counterfeit medications, we're not talking so much about recreational drugs. We're talking about people who actually are in pain, like me right now. But this has made me so adverse to taking medications that I just had shoulder surgery. I was just 3 weeks ago. I was just diagnosed with 2 ulcers last week, and I have shingles right now because of all the pain. I don't want to. That's my buddy, right?
You don't want that. You don't want that.
And I'm extremely hesitant to take Percocet, which is what the doctor gave me for my shoulder, because of what we heard from the victims this morning. My God, it astounds me that when I hear people say that there are people that believe that counterfeit medications is not a legitimate issue. My gosh, just listen to some of these poor folks, what they've gone through. Step into their shoes and live just a minute in their shoes and see what you think about it after that.
Thanks, Steve. I would like, you mentioned something that Keith Brown said, and I want to add to what he said. When the DEA became very aggressive on the opioid abuse issue, and they started taking down the pill mills and the bad doctors, the bad wholesalers, I'm sure you're all familiar with the squeezing the balloon phenomena. And when you squeeze the balloon on one end, what happens? It pops up somewhere else. And I think what's so interesting, and I'll ask Javier to comment on this, when DEA effectively shut down the availability, the access to these pain medicines in the United States, the substance abusers, those people who were sick with addiction, they didn't just get better, right? They still needed the medicine. And what happened, Javier?
We saw that, like I said, my last post was in Houston, Texas. And remember the pain pills, when we started clamping down on them in Florida, we started shutting them down. What happened? They opened up shop in Houston. And then I would never forget, I'd go out with the guys, with our surveillance. At the doctor's office, you would see about 30 people lined up. I mean, wow. Louisiana place in the parking lot. And they always had an armed guard inside the office. And the visits, we'd send in undercover guys. It'd be about a 3-minute visit, be about $400 cash. Doctor, whatever, Oxycontin, Percocets, whatever you wanted. There was no examination. But, and then we went after them. We started, shutting them down. Then we saw the emergence of the opioid crisis. So the balloon effect is very important, because we're vulnerable. And whenever we put pressure, they're going to learn. And one other thing that I always tell people when I'm speaking is, and Houston was a great learning experience for me. I got to see. Remember the synthetic marijuana that was hitting our streets? I think there's still some, right? But in Houston, we were big, and you know how they were mixing it? Wow. We'd go, there'd be a house, a garage, they would have cement mixers. Can you believe? I mean, actual cement mixers. They would put the barley, so it'd be green leafy stuff. Then they put in the cannabinoid, which they bring in from China. So then they would package it in all these colorful packages, and young kids were buying them at service stations. It wasn't against the law. I'd go in, I'd take them out. I didn't care. Anyway, Scooby-Doo packages, colorful packages. Kids were dying. And you know why? That package gets so concentrated, there's no checks and balances on the mixture. So you're going to have about 20 packages that are like 90% concentrated, because it's being mixed in a cement mixer. And that's what was getting young kids hurt. A lot of young kids were dying because of this.
So in summary, I would just say that while we won't take questions here at the panel, the guys will be around in the hallway afterwards. And again, they'll have their show on Saturday night, and they're always great afterwards at answering questions. But I just kind of want to wrap up with the fact that we often hear this very simple solution to prescription drug pricing well, let's just open up the internet. Let's just do it through Don's country. Let's just bring stuff through Canada. But it's not that simple, right? It's a very complex equation. And these are no longer one-off bad pharmacists in China making Viagra. These are sophisticated, violent drug trafficking organizations like MS-13. We have an undercover video with the woman running the drug manufacturing operation in San Salvador, using medical school students from the university in San Salvador, making counterfeit medicines. And when our informant, who told me about the revenue being generated by MS-13 from counterfeit medicines, asked her, do these medicines work because I'm selling them wholesale in the United States? She says, mijo, we're not making medicine, we're making money. There's no medicine in these products. Well, now, as Javier said, we're preying on patients. And it's one thing if a substance abuser who has an illness, which frankly is an evolution and growth for police officers, right? When we first saw drug addicts, we thought they were criminals. Today, we've grown up and we recognize that's an illness, and we need to treat it as an illness. Well, when that illness persists and they're being preyed upon with these dangerous counterfeit medicines, at least we can educate that person on where they're going. But when somebody buys a prescription medicine from a website with a Canadian flag on it, and they've been told by a legislator or somebody else they believe, a doctor, that those are safe medicines, you can do that, and it's a maintenance medicine, so it's HIV, hypertension, cardiology, cancer, how do they know? There's no adverse event. You ultimately have an event like death, and ultimately you died from the disease that had gone untreated because you got subtherapeutic, sub-dosage medicine. And so I want to thank the panel, because the expertise you shared hopefully opened some eyes and better inform people about the risks associated with importation. And it's not every day you get to sit with the narcos and really, and they're celebrities for sure. But Sam Lewis is a prosecutor like we just don't see in America. And to have a Canadian police officer with 30 years on the job join us in America to share his experience is really terrific. And we thank everybody for participating today. And we thank the Partnership for Safe Medicines for affording us this opportunity to share our experience. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Marv Shepard. I'm the president of the board of directors for Partnership for Safe Medicines. And I want to thank everybody for coming today. And hopefully you got enlightened by the testimonies and the explanations in the briefings by all the panelist members. It's been a real treat to have you here. And I thank you very much for attending. In the last hour, an hour and a half, we have given the overview challenges, and you can see the challenges are tremendous on fighting counterfeit medications. And we looked at the terrible consequences, as stated earlier today. The human toll of these is unbelievable when you think about all of the counterfeit drugs being in the United States and how we can stop the unsafe drugs into the United States. Please visit our website, safemedicines.org. It has a ton of written material, pamphlets, and some outside in the hallway. You can contact us directly if you need any of that material to be disseminated to your friends, colleagues, office workers, or anywhere else you can think of about getting them out there. We currently work with patient allies, as seen from our chart here. And we're assembling a joint letter right now about the dangers of breaking the secure supply chain in the United States. The United States is relatively safe medications because it is secure and closed. You saw it's been mentioned, it's illegal to import, and everything is FDA approved. That is secure, and that's what's our basis of wanting to keep that supply chain as secure as possible, so we don't have influx of trying to control it. As mentioned, it would be just about impossible to control drug importation on the quality of the pharmaceuticals. I don't know how you could ever do that. It'd be terrible. So if you'd like to sign our letter about of initially breaking this secure chain line, you can find the information on the front page of our website, safemedicines.org. Please let us know and we can get that letter out to everybody. It's really affected by it. Thank you again, and I enjoyed you having everybody with attendance. It was a super attendance. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Later today on C-SPAN 3, a preview of the Trump administration's 2020 defense budget proposal. That'll be live from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, starting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern.
C-SPAN, where history unfolds daily. In 1979, C-SPAN was created as a public service by America's cable television companies.